Welcome to another episode of the Rest Is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And me, Rory Stewart.
And we are in the same room.
It's amazing. I don't often get to see Alastair. I keep forgetting how big he is. I just came into his dressing room. We're in the Royal Albert Hall. He's got shoes about the size of a sofa, I discovered.
Size 12. And we're in the Royal Albert Hall because tonight we are performing here on the day of the rail strike. And I've got to say, Rory, it is a bit weird. Let's just be honest. When we first started this thing a few months ago, I don't think either of us thought that by, December, we'd be filling out the Albert Hall. It's a bit bonkers.
It's really bonkers. I don't really remember, but when you first approached me about it, I think we were talking about doing a trial run of something like 8 or 9 episodes.
Yeah.
And we've now done who knows how many hours. We actually got somebody who claimed that they'd listened to sort of 1,000 hours, didn't they?
I know, they've got to get out more. They said they'd listen to 11 days worth. But I can give a kind of counterpoint to that. You'll find now you're back briefly in London, Rory, that as you walk around, you will get people endlessly just saying, love your podcast, love your podcast, love it, because it happens all the time. Fiona
happened to be in Paris last night. I walked into the Brasserie Lippe,
okay,
right there, next to Saint-Germain.
Yeah.
And I walked in and immediately we had somebody at the first table at the door say, love your podcast, love Alastair Campbell, good luck tomorrow.
It's weird, isn't it? So let me just put a little sort of counterpoint. Fiona and I were walking the dog the other day, and a woman stopped me, and she said, I've really tried hard to listen to your podcast, but I can't do it. You talk too much. You're far too fond of your own opinions, and I don't like the other guy anyway.
It's very good. And she couldn't even remember my name. I was very sick with that.
You were the other guy.
Just the other guy, yeah.
But it was sort of, I think you need those moments to bring it down to it. Now listen, you've just come in from Paris, but having been in Qatar.
Having been in Qatar, yep, for the World Cup, which is where, since we last spoke.
Now, first of all, when we first had the discussion about Qatar and whether the World Cup should be there, and all the human rights stuff and gay rights and stuff, so just give me a sense of, one, whether you've had any flack for being there, two, what your sense was and what the experience was like, and then we'll get on to how you've become an amazing football expert and pundit.
Well, thank you, Alastair. So I think the first thing that was very striking, I mean, I guess everybody's heard endlessly about the World Cup, but it was a very, very unusual feeling. There weren't crowds in the streets. There wasn't drinking. The matches that I saw, and I saw 2 of them live, the crowds surrounding me were often people who were mostly, it seemed to be many of them, migrant workers from Doha. So there were a lot of Filipinos, a lot of Indians, supporting the Portuguese team or whatever. And one of the things that Qataris are actually quite proud of, and maybe this has been in the British press, is that it's a much more diverse audience, and many people who wouldn't otherwise be able to afford tickets are in those crowds because they're given tickets for $4 or $5 to get in.
Oh, so they were filling the stadiums with local people?
Yeah, and a lot of them are local people on low incomes, which was very interesting. It made for a much more, I think you probably, if you went, you might have felt the atmosphere wasn't quite as intense. But equally, I saw your friend Gary Lineker, and I saw David Dean and Arsene Wenger and all these people, and one of the things they were saying is that they'd been able to see 40 live matches, and they'd never been to a World Cup, but they'd been able to do that because the stadiums were so close to each other. So I think if you're really interested in the game as opposed to the kind of fan dimension, I think it was pretty exciting.
And what about the kind of just around the place? My son Rory has been there, and he said he found it very strange. You didn't, outside of the stadiums, you didn't really feel there was a World Cup going on.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, there was nobody in the streets. There's no big gathering places. There's no bars open. No, I think that feels completely different.
And the football, would you say you understand the game better now, having watched a few games live?
I can definitely understand much better why you're so enthusiastic for it. Interestingly, the England team's been surprisingly sort of stable from when I was last watching them. So I do feel that I've got some relationship to them. But much less with France. With some of these other teams, I've got no idea. Portugal I really enjoyed. I saw the 6-1 Portugal victory. Very, very exciting.
Big decision. Talk about big, bold decisions. Sacking Ronaldo, dropping Ronaldo and putting on the kid who gets a hat-trick.
It seemed to really work, didn't it?
Did, yeah.
And I thought they was really vindicated. And then when Ronaldo finally came on, and the whole crowd around me was saying, where's Ronaldo, where's Ronaldo? And actually the entire chant from the stadium was Ronaldo, Ronaldo, Ronaldo. That's all the crowd wanted to do was see Ronaldo. And eventually he came on very belatedly, but he seemed very kind of stiff and slow and awkward.
It's called ageing, Rory. It happens to us all.
Yeah,
I
except...
mean, I never talk about when I played with Pele and Maradona, but I'm just not the same person that I was then.
How old were you when you played with Pele and Maradona?
I played with Maradona when I was 49, and I was 51 when I played with Pele. So and I wasn't at my best, but I'd never really been at my best. And you sort of, I get the feeling that you, from our WhatsApp exchanges, that you got very fond of the Croatians.
I did.
And of course, by the time this goes out, we'll know whether Croatia are into their second successive final. But whether they do or they don't get through, the success of Croatian football is an incredible story.
Their first game against Japan was incredibly boring. That was went to penalties.
Should we remind people that I said it would be the first game that would go to penalties? Should we remind people that?
You do know a lot about football. That is absolutely true. But the next game, when they took on Brazil, was extraordinary because I'd never seen... I mean, that was sort of heroic. I could see the appeal of football there because you got the sense that they were down. You would have thought almost any other country in the world would be out, and they just kept going. And their 37-year-old captain was not hobbling around like Ronaldo.
No, he's one of those guys who can. He seems to be able to walk and play really, 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 really well. The thing about Croatia, though, because it's like, if you think about all the fuss that there was for Wales being there with a very small population, just over 3 million, Croatia is between Wales and Scotland, and yet they got to a World Cup final. They've impressed the world yet again, and I think there is something. If you go back. So when they were part of Yugoslavia, 2 of the top 4 teams in the old Yugoslavia were from Croatia, Hajduk Split and Dinamo Zagreb. So they've got that kind of tradition, but then there must be something else that's just really, really special about them as a sport, that they're so good at it when... Wales getting there was seen like a miracle.
So I tried this. There's this new big release by OpenAI, which everybody's been downloading on their phones, which writes essays for you.
Oh, my God. Have you seen the stuff they've done about this podcast?
It's absolutely extraordinary. Yeah, so we should get on to the stuff done about podcasts. But I asked it, why was Croatia doing so well in football? And the computer's response was very, very polished. It talked about its youth development, talked about its strong footballing tradition, talked about its fan base, etc. And I was quite impressed, but a bit suspicious. So then I asked it, why was Spain so successful in football? And I got exactly the same answer. And I realized basically it's kind of classic Oxford and Cambridge bluffer, that computer.
Yeah.
It doesn't really have any information. It's kind of skimming along the surface.
So it didn't mention Dynamo Zagreb and Hajduk Split.
No content at all, just very generic. Good youth development, good fan base,
excellent,
strong footballing tradition.
Because they did. I did see one that they did of could it present us doing a comedy sketch, and it was moderately funny.
That was moderately funny.
Yeah, it was. The other thing because this is the Rest Is Politics, not the Rest Is Football. But I'll tell you a big political point is that the Croatia FA was recognised by America before FIFA, so they played a friendly between Croatia and the United States before Croatia was even recognised, and that was seen as it was quite a big political moment for them, both politically and in football terms.
So I lived in Croatia. I worked there as a diplomat just at the time of the Kosovo War, so after the Bosnia War. The story of America's connection to Croatia was really important for Bosnia because America basically funded, so Croatia broke away from former Yugoslavia, early 90s. It lost bits of its territory to Serbia. It was trained by American contractors, stroke mercenaries, stroke CIA forces. It did this great advance at the end of 95 called the Storm, which involved some pretty extreme ethnic cleansing of all the Serbian populations. Tudjman, who was then their president, basically a proto-war criminal. Mm-hmm. There was a very sinister history going back to their connection with the Nazis during the Second World War and some very extreme expatriate groups that were sending in weapons. And Croatia remains, like some of those other states in former Yugoslavia, a state which has been doing very well economically, which has a very nice veneer on the top of lovely tourism and these wonderful islands around the Croatian coast like Korčula. But its politics remains pretty bizarre. The HDZ, this nationalist party, continues to have a grip on power. And it's a similar story, really, in Bosnia and in Serbia. But, of course, Croatia's in the EU, about to join the Euro, when Bosnia and Serbia isn't. And the Bosnians particularly feel...
And Bulgaria and Romania as well have been kept out, haven't they? So Croatia is it's way further down the track
on the euro. Yeah.
So but it is an extraordinary success story, though. It really is. I mean, I agree with you that the politics, I think, is still tough. I think that whole region, though, that's the reason why I like the Balkans, I think, so much, is the politics is pretty brutal. But they do get stuff done. I mean, the advance of Croatia as an independent country since, as you say, the early 90s, is pretty remarkable. To think that they're now going to be part of the Schengen zone, they're heading towards the euro, it's pretty extraordinary, really.
It is.
Well, I see we were criticised for saying extraordinary and incredibly too much.
Shouldn't say that anymore.
I wonder if that's being picked up by the bots.
Yeah.
Now listen, shall we go to, you're back in your homeland, the United Kingdom. I don't know if you've noticed while you've been away, Rory, but it's a bit of a mess.
I've seen you've been tweeting about getting stuck on trains, and that wasn't strikes, was it? That was just hopelessness.
No, that was just an absolutely horrific day at Euston where trains were getting cancelled left, right and centre. I saw at the weekend, I saw somebody on the Labour front bench who was saying that this sense that the country just isn't working, I think is going to form a very, very big part of how they move into the next election. They've then got to show how it would work better under Labour. But I think the strikes are fascinating because today we've got the rail strike. Your poor mum who's going to come by train, she's going to have to fly. I'm going to Aberdeen tomorrow and I wanted to get the sleeper and can't. So, we're all going to have to do stuff we maybe don't want to do. But then you look at the nurses' strike and the postal strike and the teachers' strike and the lecturers' strike.
How do you feel about this? Because I guess you're divided, aren't you? Because I maybe this is wrong, but my sense of you is that when you were in government with Tony Blair, you would have felt that you needed to take a relatively strong line on some of this. Since you've left government, I think you've tended to be more enthusiastic about unions, strikes, about Mick Lynch. I don't think you were a great friend of the RMT, particularly in the...
No, and certainly not during the referendum either, as they were the first union to come out ridiculously for Brexit. I'd like to talk to Mick Lynch about that at some point. He was a bit rattled on the airwaves this morning, I thought. Very un-Mick Lynch. He does that thing which I like to do.
That was with Today programme, Michel Hussein.
Yeah, and he does that thing which I like to do with the media when you push it back onto them. But he did it so much. Why are you pursuing that line of questioning? Why are you just parroting the lines of the establishment and the Sun and the Mail and the Telegraph? Now, I do that to people, but I think if you make that the main point of your interview, you start to think, No, I think I'm more sympathetic because I think the gap, and I think the public generally are more sympathetic than they normally are. And I think it's because the divide and rule strategy, which I think the Tories are trying to do, is not working. I really got offended by Sunak. They're using this bogus figure about it's going to cost every family £1,000 a year, which is not. It's complicated, but it's not accurate. It's even at the top end, you're talking about 600 quid. But he's got this language that they use about punishing ordinary hard-working families, as if these aren't ordinary hard-working families. And they're ordinary hard-working families, a lot of them, who are using food banks, who are having to try and get benefits to top up their salaries. And I think we're back to this point we've talked about before, that there's more poverty in this country than I think sometimes the political and media classes are prepared to acknowledge.
I think the starting point, you're completely right. Inflation is at least 10%, and people's wages are not remotely keeping up. And so everybody, private, public sector, is facing a real terms cut in their pay packages. People will be worse off, and they'll be even more worse off next year as the economy goes into recession. So I guess the question is, what do we make of the strikes? On the one hand, sympathise, inflation up, people struggling. On the other hand, I think just a couple of small things. One is that most people in Britain no longer work for the public sector, they work for the private sector. Many people working in businesses are not going to have anything like those pay rises.
Although the private sector pay is rising faster than public sector pay.
It is, but not at the level of which nurses. I mean, nurses are asking at the moment for 19.8% pay rise.
Some of them, yeah.
That's double inflation. And I noticed that Wes Streeting from Labour has been very, very clear and hard about that. And he's raised something I'd love us to talk about a bit more, which is he's, I think quite rightly, and I admire him, said we can't just be talking about pay, we need to talk about reforming the NHS. And in the end, we need to talk about service delivery. He was very, very violently brutal about the GPs who just voted that they were only going to work 9 to 5. And I think that's interesting. And you presumably, as Labour, had to do some of those things in order to make yourselves electable.
The BMA is a very, very powerful trade union. But because they're doctors, they're not necessarily seen in the same way as, Mick Lynch, working class guys. But they're a very powerful union. I think I, as you know, I regularly defend GPs, and I defend my GP is absolutely brilliant, and our local surgery is fantastic. But I think what West Streeting is doing is it's back to this thing we've talked about before: Labour refusing to fall into traps that are being laid by the Tories. So the Tories want to create a situation where we're for the people trying to sort these strikes out, even though brackets we're not going to sit down and talk to them in the way that they might want to talk to us. And meanwhile, Labour, because they've got their history of the trade unions, they are backing the strikers.
Can I just very quickly on they won't sit down and talk? So I had to deal with prison officer strikes. And prison officer strikes are particularly a terrifying type of strike, because when prison officers go on strike, the only people left to run a prison are the managers of the prison, of whom there are very few. And within about 48 hours, it becomes almost impossible to run a prison. You can't get food through to prisoners. You certainly can't unlock them. And I remember when I went into those negotiations that I would sit down with the unions. I remember we sat down in Pret-a-Manger around the corner from Parliament with the heads of the unions. And I thought I had a very good conversation with them.
Sorry, you had a pay negotiation in Pret-a-Manger?
In Pret-a-Manger around the corner from thing.
Did you have a crowd?
Have a crowd. So it was a really, really good conversation. And but I thought I'm making some progress here. We were making some promises on what we could do to protect prison officers, legislation to make sure that if they were assaulted, there were proper punishments. About 45 minutes after our meeting, the head of the Prison Officers Union went straight out to Parliament Green and told the press that the government was refusing to negotiate with them. Mm. And I had to go straight out an hour later saying, I have no idea what this guy is talking about. I literally was sitting with him having a cup of coffee an hour before. And there's definitely, I get the impression, a game going on here, because I notice Mick Lynch at the moment is saying, yeah, okay, I'm guessing to talk to certain people, but I demand to talk to Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, personally. And the Prime Minister is refusing to talk to me. So it's clearly part of, is it or is it not? I think it's part of the union playbook.
Well, the RCN did the same thing. The RCN basically said, this is now, you're talking about the future of the health service, our ability to deliver care over Christmas period. We should sit down with the Prime Minister. And it's an obvious kind of tactic. I do think there has been a sense, and the other very interesting interview this morning was with Mark Harper, the Transport Secretary, who was asked the same question 6 times about whether he had put on the table this idea of driver-only trains, and this was like a kind of red line for him, and he would not answer. And Justin Webb was getting more and more frustrated because it seems it's a one-fact question. And so I think there's obviously something going on there that maybe the RMT have been briefing about, that this is being driven by government, but the government want to pretend that it's not. And I think the government sort of constantly saying...
And this is no driver trains, right? Which is the thing that we've had in the tube. Because
no, I think this is driver only.
Driver only, okay.
Yeah.
Because definitely there's been this big problem in the London Underground.
Oh,
which
yeah,
is
driverless.
That many other countries have tubes running without drivers, and the unions have blocked it again and again, claiming that it's unsafe.
Yeah. So, but I think that we never had a situation. We had industrial action, we had strikes to deal with when we were in government, but we never had this kind of jigsaw that seems to be coming together. And I think when it does come together like that, I think the government does have to have a kind of overall strategy. Because at the moment, they're saying that this is all down to the independent pay review body, but the independent pay review, they don't negotiate, they make recommendations. And they make recommendations usually within quite a tight envelope that the government has set for them. I think for the trains now, there's not going to be an actual full railway service day between now and the second week of January. So, and then if you get the nurses on top of that, and you get the schools and universities obviously going to shut for a while, but you get them coming back.
Yeah.
So I've been very struck by the fact that it seems to me even parts of the right-wing media are not really getting stuck into the unions in the way that they might have done historically, because I think they think their readers are quite sympathetic.
Well, I think there's obviously been a big change in the place of unions in society and the way that they're viewed. We're not back in the 70s anymore. I think it's also that the arguments for government restraint on pay are quite complicated. And it's quite easy for the unions to outmaneuver them and make them seem cruel and uncaring. But let me try to, in my role as defender of the government, try to make that case.
Why do you embrace this role so readily? You know, you'll probably get booed tonight if you say that.
Somebody's got to put the other side of the story. So I think public pay is £233 billion a year at the moment. And if the government puts up pay, I don't know how much it puts it up by, but they've already agreed to put it up by 3%. And then I think with teachers and other groups, they've agreed to put it up considerably more. But obviously the maths are pretty stark. I mean, if you went with the nurses, which is 20%, you'd be looking at 50 billion. They're obviously not going to do that. And the problem is that whatever they do, 5%, 7%, it's not just 1 year, it's every year. And it's the pensions. And it's at a time when our deficit is already out of control. So the government has to think, do we or do we not want to add 10 or 15 billion pounds a year extra to our bill from now onwards? And that's a lot of money. I mean, 10, 15 billion pounds pays for a very, very big chunk of your schools.
I mean, you can buy an awful lot of dud PPE for that, and you can get a lot of peerages for that.
You totally can, but you can also pay for a lot of police officers with that. You can pay for a lot of the education.
But I do think this is part of the problem they're having.
Yeah.
I think the waste that people have seen, the inequality that people see, I think every time, and I read a thing in the Sunday Times at the weekend, Michelle Mone is not even the big one. She's getting all the coverage because she's in the House of Lords, but they ran a full account of all these different companies that have made shed loads of money and provided dud PPE. And the people look at that and think, well, hold on a minute, you found the money for that, government.
Yeah, but the point is, I agree, but governments often, this government included, waste a lot of money. And you're right, the public often look and think, you must have an incredible amount of money down back of the sofa because you're spending all this money on all this other stuff.
And the other point, Rory.
And this is what people are always saying about international aid. If you can find 12 billion for international aid, surely you can spend this. But the fact is, we're talking about big money. We're talking about 10, 20 billion pounds a year more. And we're also talking about an anxiety, which is, again, economists are going to go back and forth on that, but is it going to feed into inflation? How are people going to spend this money? Is this going to contribute to rising prices? And the challenge for Labour, and I think they're doing very well on this, is not falling into the trap of sounding like Mick Lynch and sounding like there is a magic money tree and that somehow, if they came into government, they would just be awarding massive inflation-busting pay rises and they'd be spending more money on everything.
Yeah.
Because the truth is they can't do that and this government can't do it either.
And that's why both parties going into the next election have got to have a proper strategy for growth. And that's quite hard to get out there at the moment when the people are feeling so down about the state of the world. But the other point, Rory, which I don't think you can get away from in this context, so looking back recently, people look at, well, you found all that money for COVID, you found all that money for your Tory mates in the VIP fast lane, etc. But then you go back a decade to the first round of austerity, and I think people are feeling, well, we've heard this message before about you have to tighten your belt. And it's all going to come good. And it hasn't for so many people.
100%. Well, the weirdness that we've forgotten is that, of course, there are two very different Tory parties that have existed since 2010. So there was the George Osborne, David Cameron austerity, which was all about trying to reduce the deficit, reduce the debt, cut public spending. Then you had Boris Johnson come in, and what people forget is that he spent money like water. This giving money out to his COVID friends was part of Boris Johnson saying, end of austerity, turn on the spending streams. He put a lot more money into the NHS. He put more money into education. He was putting more money into Northern England. There were huge announcements on all this stuff because he genuinely believed that austerity was a total waste of time and that there was no reason why Britain couldn't borrow and spend like Billy.
Is that what he believed?
Very much, and that's why he did so for 2 years. He spent 2 years borrowing and spending like Billy.
I've spent much of my life trying to work out what Boris
goodness
Johnson
knows if he believes anything at all. But he was somebody who was naturally liked to be popular, and an obvious way as a populist politician of being popular is just to borrow and spend a lot of money. So that Rishi Sunak is now going back to a story from 2010, but people forget that in the middle, there was 2 years of Boris turning on the spending.
I do think Rishi Sunak listened to our interview with Julia Gillard, by the way. He's definitely taken her advice. Try and take the oxygen out of politics. Try and take politics. Don't be on the news the whole time. He's definitely very, very low profile.
And do you think that was good advice from him? Would you have given him that advice?
I think for him, yeah, I think it's not a bad thing that he's not. It's also interesting. He's apparently he doesn't think they should do this kind of morning media round. We talked about this before, but I bumped into a couple of people from the Today programme the other day who were gagging for that to happen. I think because they find these morning round interviews with ministers just a complete and total waste of time as well. Now, should we take a break and come back to the state of the world in its many forms?
Let's do that. This episode of The Rest Is Politics is sponsored by The New European. Now, Alastair, do you know what a bookazine is?
A bookazine, I do know what a bookazine is.
Oh, rubbish.
It's a book, but it's kind of got the feel of a magazine.
Okay, because that is what The New European's about to produce. They're going to take 100 of their best covers, binding them into a book. Now, what's your favourite New European cover?
Oh, there have been some great front covers, but I think if I could only have one, there was one when Johnson was Prime Minister, and the headline was, "It's all their fault." You know, Johnson in the middle, and you just had these hands kind of pointing out everywhere, and it just captured absolutely brilliantly how it's always somebody else's fault but his.
The New European have got a special offer for Trip listeners. You can get a digital subscription for £1 a week, or both print and digital for £2 a week.
I think we should give every new subscriber a free copy of this bookazine on top of the bargain subscription.
No. Really?
Yeah.
So you heard it here first. Take out a subscription between now and Christmas, and Alastair Campbell is going to guarantee that you get a free book of their brilliant covers worth £15 thrown in.
Yeah, I'm going to guarantee that.
Sign up at www.theneweuropean.co.uk/trip. So welcome back to The Rest Is Politics with me, Rory Stewart.
And me, Alastair Campbell.
And we're still sitting here in the Albert Hall, which is still pretty surprising. I'm actually going slightly blind, staring at these, the spotlights you have on mirrors.
We're in a dressing room. I wonder if the cheeky chappie's ever been in here, Rory.
Definitely. I was looking at all the photographs on the wall, and the Albert Hall basically tells the entire story of British history in this bizarre way. There's a out there, you can see a big photograph, which they were obviously very proud of when they redecorated in the 80s, which they might be less proud of today, which is the Albert Hall was the scene of the annual production of Hiawatha from 1923 to 1939, only interrupted by the general strike, as we were just talking about, but played with a real Indian chief in a headdress. You're thinking, whoa, I'm not sure we're going to be doing that anymore.
Now, listen, we've both been in France in the last... you've been there last night. I was there a few days ago, and I was there the day that the launch of the Citizens' Assembly on fin de vie, end of life. And I'd completely forgotten this, that there was a Citizens' Assembly in the Commons about the environment, and it kind of went nowhere because there was no political oomph behind it. Whereas Macron and Elizabeth Bourne, the Prime Minister, are really behind this. But it's a
Can
it's a
I just tell people roughly what a Citizens' Assembly is? So there are different versions of it, but the biggest, best example of it to begin with was in Ireland, where they did a Citizens' Assembly around abortion, which, of course, in the Republic of Ireland, incredibly controversial issue. But by getting what's really like a jury, you randomly select citizens, put them in a room, representative sample of ordinary people, and then you have experts on the subject brief people over a few days on all the different details. And the amazing thing is that what they found with Ireland on abortion is that instead of emerging with everybody divided into yes and no, they begin to get into how about 28 days, what happens if you're raped, and they ended up with a proposal which then became Irish law. And I wanted to see the same on Brexit, because I believe that actually the only way through Brexit was to put Brexiteers and Remainers in a room, and I think they would have ended up at a sort of customs union single market option if they'd been given a chance to do that. Anyway, back to you and end of life.
So that's exactly what they've done. They've got 173 people aged between 18 and 87, according to a kind of demographic, but then all the people within that, they're drawn by lots. They're going to spend 9 weekends together with experts, as you say, with psychological support, with fact checkers. And they're not being asked to produce a policy, but they might produce a policy. They're just being asked to address all the issues, and people can follow it all live on stream. You can see what's going on, and I think what's fascinating about it is Macron. He hates the word euthanasia, understandably, but that's kind of where the debate started. It's now into they're calling it fin de vie. I guess assisted suicide is where it's going to going to end up. But it's got that political leadership. The Speaker of this National Assembly is going to be present, was present for the first weekend. So it's really kind of, it's literally saying, right, we're the politicians, we want this debate to take place, and we're giving you this forum within which to do it. And it's happening at a time when I asked the campaigns here. So there's movement in Scotland. There's a introduction of a assisted dying for terminally ill adults bill in the Scottish Parliament.
Just very quickly on that, your friend Andrew Mitchell, who's now the Development Minister, is a big champion of assisted dying and always wanted us to talk about it on this podcast. So he'll be grateful.
Ditto Charlie Faulkner on the same thing.
Yep.
11 states in the US, all 6 states in Australia. New Zealand nationwide, Canada nationwide, Colombia nationwide,
and of course
several European countries.
Famously Switzerland. In my constituency, I remember an old lady saying to me, she didn't need to pay to go to Switzerland to die. She just had to check herself into the Cumberland Infirmary.
No, you can't say that. You can't say that, Rory.
No, I definitely can say that. That was in the height of our superbug disaster.
Oh, my God.
It was a lovely kind of vision that all she had to do was save a bit of money by going to hospital.
But it's definitely, as a debate, it's moving, and I sort of feel we're not having it here at all. I mean, you're right that there's lots of pressure for it, but I don't hear much from the government.
No, we don't hear much about it. But I also love the idea of citizens' assemblies. I know that a lot of my friends think I'm mad because they think that I'm romantic about the public. My view is that actually, generally, the public sat down in that way, come up with a much better answer than politicians because they're not party-pre, they don't have any political interests. And these questions are questions which are, they're not specialist questions around abortion or end of life, or even, I think, ultimately Brexit, are definitely questions which can be explained, which people have a right to have a view on, and where people can work their way through towards a compromise. One of the lovely things about it is that you tend to, for someone like me who's a horrible centrist, you tend to end up with a pretty centrist solution because people compromise.
No, when you talked about a citizens' assembly on Brexit being Remainers and Leavers, you meant not politicians.
Exactly. It was going to be, my idea was 300 people selected at random from the entire country, demographically representative, put in a room weekend after weekend with experts talking through the issues, coming up with a proposal.
No, but remember, Roy, we'd had enough of experts by then. Mr. Gove said no more experts.
The lucky thing is I remember when I proposed it, it really annoyed my colleagues in Parliament. They kept saying, we already have a citizens' assembly.
It's called Parliament.
You've got it, exactly.
Yeah.
And then when I went up against Dominic Raab in the leadership debate, he'd obviously done a focus group where he'd decided that the thing to say was, Rory Stewart is proposing Venezuela. This guy is Maduro with his citizens' assemblies. They kind of felt it was like I was going on a Cuban model. But I think this is the future. And I think our population's never been so educated, never been so well-travelled, and people are completely fed up with just vesting these decisions in Parliament. And I think a representative citizens' assembly is a really good way of addressing our major issues.
And you're right as well that the Brexit debate became so polarised. The idea of putting, dare I say, people like me in a room with people like Nigel Farage and come up with a solution. I mean, it would not happen without violence, would it? That's
Luckily, there wouldn't be you and Nigel Farage. It would be 300 more people who are less politicised. And I think that's where we would have ended up.
Yeah. Well, at the moment, every 8 days, a British citizen travels to Switzerland to be helped to die.
Wow. It's a lot of people.
It's quite a lot of people, isn't it?
Quite a lot of people.
Yeah. So,
and of course, it's very difficult to comment on because on the one hand, you can get into debates about how it goes wrong. And of course, it goes wrong, or could go wrong, if the elderly feel that they're under pressure from their relatives.
Yeah, and of course, dementia is adding another layer of
and you don't, I definitely have had relatives and godparents. I remember saying to me, I'm just a burden. I should probably get out of the way. And you can imagine maybe psychologically how that could contribute to this. But on the other hand, very difficult to comment on unless you've had a relative who's been through it. I mean, I think one of the things we've picked up on Twitter is that if you've actually had a family member in that extreme situation, you feel that nobody really should be judging this who hasn't had that direct experience. Yeah.
When I was in Paris, I picked up a newspaper. There was an interview with a guy called Theo, and he was part of the Dutch inquiry and the Committee of Control in charge of assisted dying there. And he said that they've had a quadruple of cases since it brought in. And he was an absolute advocate for it. He's become less certain because he thinks that the criteria are kind of spreading and widening. But anyway, I think it's a great way to have the debate. I agree with you about that, and I think it is moving. And of course, France is a Catholic country still.
Yep.
In the main. The other amazing,
which is why it's important, because the sanctity of life.
Absolutely. The other thing I picked up while I was over there is that Macron refers to the Pope as tu.
He doesn't vous voyez the Pope.
Il vous voit pas le pape.
Very interesting. Gosh, very interesting.
Isn't it? So he's clearly got a very familiar friendship with le pape.
Final thing, I was having a cup of tea in Jordan 2 days ago, and an Iranian-British couple came up to me and gave me a real row, justifiable, I think now, for the lack of focus that we've put recently on what's happening in Iran, and particularly, not you and me being in trouble, but the British government. And they feel that just to remind everybody, going back in time, over the last 80 days, there have been a series of very, very brave demonstrations, and unusually, it's a revolutionary movement not run in Iran by intellectuals. It's run by sports people. It's run by women. Women are increasingly not wearing headscarves. There's amazing acts of people knocking turbans off Shia clerics in the streets. And we're in a situation in which many thousands of people have now been arrested, maybe as many as 15,000, probably 400 have been killed. The Iranian regime is desperate to hang on. Khamenei, who's the supreme leader, believes that the lesson of the Iranian Revolution in 79 and the lesson of 89 to 91 in Russia and the lesson of the Arab Spring in 2011 is that you mustn't give an inch, because if you give an inch, you're finished. So he's trying to really hold on hard. But the criticism is that whereas the Germans and the Canadians and many others have spoken out strongly in favour of the protesters and have sanctioned the Revolutionary Guard, Britain is so far holding off from doing it. And I was reminded of that because you've just done this interview with Mrs. Litvinenko, who was very critical of successive governments, Tony Blair, William Hague in the Foreign Office, for their failure to stand up for Litvinenko against Russia. And there's something in the Foreign Office, I think, which can be, or feels from a distance, as though it can be a bit overly cautious about confronting regimes and calling them out. I
mean, just on Marina Litvinenko, who, by the way, was fantastic. I really, really enjoyed talking to her. Her criticism of us in the early days was that we initially didn't give asylum to Litvinenko because she felt we were a bit too close to Putin, or trying to get a bit closer to Putin. And then with Hague and Theresa May, it was about lack of access to papers and such like. But what's happening in Iran is, I mean, 2 23-year-olds have been executed this week. One charged with enmity against God, the other one with corruption on earth. 488 now killed, 18,259 defeated since the treatment of Mahsa Amini, which set the whole thing off. And I mean, I think you're right. I think we're back to this thing about the normalisation of really bad stuff very, very quickly. And I sent you this morning, James Cleverly, the Foreign Secretary, made his so-called big foreign policy speech today. I mean, it is so vacuous, it's almost mind-blowing. It was billed as this is going to be the sort of foreign policy post-Brexit. And I honestly, I've read it twice now, and I can't even work out what he's trying to say. I think it's been produced by one of those chat bots.
One of the OpenAI things, yeah.
But I do think you're right about Iran. You're absolutely right. And there is more that we could do, and we're not doing it. And it's back to this thing about once the media turns away from it, the government just thinks, oh, we don't need to bother about it.
Just to finish, there's been this very interesting prisoner swap where Brittany Griner, who's a US sportswoman, a well-known US sportswoman, who was detained in Russia and sentenced for having some cannabis in a vape, was swapped for Victor Bout. And Victor Bout is probably the most notorious international arms dealer in the world, who was the Americans were chasing from 9/11 onwards, and they finally got him in a sting operation in Thailand in 2008. It was one of their great kind of CIA triumphs. And it's extraordinary that you can release one of the most wanted men in the world in exchange for a basketball player who had a bit of cannabis in her vape.
And the judgments that will have gone on with that. And it was interesting how Joe Biden was very, very much wanted to be seen to be part of the whole thing. He was with Brittany Griner's partner as it was happening, met her when she got back to the States. So that was obviously a big decision that had been taken by government. We are going to do this.
And it's very strongly American too, isn't it? Because it actually happened in Afghanistan too. Peter Juvenal, who was a very distinguished, I mustn't use that word.
Oh, you're allowed. No, you're allowed with
okay.
it.
Anyway, Peter Juvenal was an amazing cameraman, often with the BBC. Did I think something like 90 trips to Afghanistan during the jihad. Was arrested by the Taliban and found himself in jail with a lot of people, including Americans. And of course, Biden negotiated to get the Americans out, and the British didn't get Peter Juvenal out for many, many weeks afterwards. And Peter's family was understandably very, very angry. But it goes all the way back to the Iranian hostage situation. It goes back to the release of prisoners of war in Vietnam. American politicians become very, very identified with this question of getting their citizens home, almost more than anyone else.
Yeah, but you do have regimes and terrorist organisations that make money through hostage taking. Now, we have an absolute very, very hard line that we don't pay, but it doesn't mean that all sorts of negotiations don't go on. I don't remember dealing with a direct hostage thing and a prisoner swap like this, but I do remember the period of, I think we talked last week about decommissioning with Cyril Ramaphosa and the Finland Prime Minister Ahtisaari when they were doing the decommissioning of RA weapons. But the other issue that was just incredibly difficult, incredibly complicated, was prisoner release, because
which prisoners were these?
Well, both sides,
right.
Who were being released as part of the agreement.
And some of these people who'd done very bad things.
Oh, God, yeah. And also some of these people who'd done very bad things to each other.
Right.
And some of them who'd done bad things to people who were in the room when we were negotiating.
Right.
And so, but the thing about, if you say, right, notorious global arms dealer.
Yes.
Who's a pal of Putin's against basketball player, you don't feel in the kind of geostrategic that it's, but you're having to make those calculations. How many unionists on life sentences for how many IRA supporters on life sentences? You're making judgments. And also, who feels more strongly about
and in both,
when they should
both
get
cases,
out.
these were people who'd killed people,
both
on the Republican side and the Union side.
And who got out early.
Proper convicted terrorists.
Absolutely, and who got out early. What's really interesting, though, I think, listen, I could be wrong about this, we'd have to check, but I'm pretty sure hardly any of them were back in jail anytime soon afterwards.
Right.
So it did kind of work in terms of, quotes, keeping the peace.
Not referring.
But these are, I guess these are questions where morality collides with politics.
So Vic Spout was a really, really big figure when I first joined the Foreign Office, and he's like a glimpse of a world which, thank goodness, has faded a little bit. But anybody wants to know about that universe, you've just got to read Frederick Forsyth's 1970s novel, The Dogs of War, which basically describes in detail how people like Vic Spout were still operating in the 90s. So the story is absolutely extraordinary. The guy was almost certainly a colonel in the GRU, so the Russian military intelligence. He speaks an extraordinary number of languages, speaks fluent Farsi, Xhosa, Zulu, Arabic. He got hold of some dodgy Antonov aeroplanes as the Soviet Union collapsed, set himself up in a sort of African air freight business, started off shipping flowers from South Africa into Dubai. So he'd buy flowers for $2, sell them for $100. Then he got onto the frozen chicken business. So he'd buy frozen chickens for $2 in South Africa, fly them up to Nigeria.
While still being with the GRU?
Well, this is the question, right? To what extent had he left them? To what extent hadn't he? But he claimed to be totally independent. Started flying frozen chickens up to Nigeria, shipping around UN peacekeepers, and then began to become very good friends with Mobutu, became very good friends with Massoud in Afghanistan, and quite quickly went from gladioli to helicopter gunships. And
where were the Antonovs at this point? They're gone.
Then expanded to more and more Antonovs, and he was operating in those days. The United Arab Emirates was the perfect place to operate out of because there were free ports there. He then shifted on to operating out of Ukraine. So this is the other thing we forget about with Ukraine now. Ukraine now is the great hero of the West and the great opponent to Russia. Ukraine in those days, late 90s, early 2000s, was the most corrupt arms mart in the world because when the Soviet Union had left, they'd left behind $40 billion worth of armaments, all of which then disappeared over the next 5-6 years. And the president of Ukraine was recorded in a tape in his office doing a deal selling to Saddam Hussein surface-to-air missiles, millions of dollars worth of surface-to-air missiles. The journalist who reported on it, this is Ukraine, was found 2 months later headless in a bath of acid on the edge of a farm just outside Kiev. And all of this is Viktor Valtsov. By the end of his time, he was running planes to Liberia, Sierra Leone, DRC. He was getting involved in Afghanistan. He was in trouble for what he was supposed to be doing for North Koreans. And the whole thing happening with this kind of big mustachioed guy who was obviously protected, or he would be dead by now, by the Putin regime.
Well, listen, Putin must be saying this has been a really good trade.
Yeah, you
to get him back for a
wrestling basketball player on a trivial
who had a bit of vaping weed. So did you? So I don't remember being involved in hostage stuff.
So
were you?
In my earlier life, before when I was a civil servant, before I became a minister, yes, and those were British hostages. I think in that case taken in Kashmir, and we would have very, very detailed meetings down in an underground cellar.
What, not Pret-a-Manger?
Not Pret-a-Manger. And they were very intense. You were working with our special forces, you were working with police liaison, you were trying to get information on the ground on where these people are located. You were trying to work out if there were any options there to extract. There were other people trying to negotiate with the local governments. And of course you had at the other end the families who often felt, and this is why, on the one hand, I'm very close to Peter Juvenal and his family, and I really feel their anger. But I also feel some sympathy for the British diplomats, because I actually am confident that they would have been working very, very hard to try to get them back.
But with limits, with limits to what they're allowed to do. Often with governments and regimes that are allowed to do an awful lot more.
100%. And politicians who are a bit nervous.
Yeah.
And regimes who are asking for huge amounts of money that we're not prepared to hand over. Meanwhile, the families are screaming and want them home.
Well, tonight on the stage of the Albert Hall, Rory, I'm going to take you hostage until you admit that austerity was a disaster, and the audience is not going to let you go out until that's happened.
And the Burnley Football Club is the greatest team that's ever existed.
No, because that would just be a lie. You don't believe even though we did have a great win at the weekend.
So well, I guess that's it. I mean, the only thing to finish on then is, what's your prediction for the results? Given that the results will be out before this comes out.
I think it's a chance of a repeat of the last final, France-Croatia. I think France are going to win it, the whole thing. I do.
You think?
I think France average. France on an off day were actually the better team than England, who were very, very strong. And all the English people in the room are shaking their heads, and the Frenchman in the room is waving his arms about and saying, "What a great pundit I am." No, I think France will win the whole thing.
Very good. Well, we'll find out. Thank you.